delighted to welcome Stephen, who is an experienced analytics leader, behavioural economist, and marketing data scientist. And I'll let him tell you a bit more about that himself. He spent a decade in academia at the University of Warwick, where he lectured, worked with admissions, and also achieved a PhD in economics before joining Deloitte as a management consultant specialising in marketing, operations, and customer analytics. And more recently, he joined Unilever as a manager, and he's going to tell us more about his pathway, his A-levels, and the advice that he's got to give to you guys that are in the talk, and obviously those that are going to watch again on YouTube. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thanks, Vicky. I appreciate it. It's great to have the opportunity to chat with you all today. As Vicky was talking, I'm aware how kind of corporate speak some of that talk can sound. I'll talk a little bit about that because I think it's a really interesting and important area where a lot of you are going to end up in careers that have titles that look something like that, but at this point in your lives you're not going to really know too much about it or what it means. So I'll hopefully give you a bit of a sense of where all that comes from and how much of it you can sort of influence and sort of choose what you do and do want to do in that space. As Vicky said, so I was at Merchants in probably 20 years ago now. It's getting a while back, so I left in 2002. I did A-levels in maths, in physics, in economics, and further maths, as well as general studies. So I kind of wanted to do at that point in my life kind of the more numeric, kind of sciencey type stuff. But I'd actually just kind of started economics that year, and that was something that ultimately kind of became my passion and my sort of area of interest. Back when I was at school, the school logo looked a bit different, the crest looked a bit different, but I appreciate that's how it looks now, so I wanted to put it on the slide. I then, as Vicky said, joined the University of Warwick, where I did an undergrad in maths and economics, and then I stayed on to do a master's in economics and then ultimately a PhD in economics. Kind of one of those serendipitous things, not hugely through choice, but when I was at my undergrad graduation, one of the lecturers came up to me and said, we've just had somebody drop out of some funding for a master's and a PhD, would you be interested in doing it? And effectively they were offering me, a paid job and a sort of an opportunity for me to continue sort of understanding and learning in an area I was really interested in. So I stayed on at university through to kind of 2012 to do the PhD. Also during that time, I think as a lot of postgrads do, I was working in sort of teaching. So I was a teaching fellow, which meant I was sort of responsible for designing the lectures and the content for kind of second year undergraduate economics as it was. So I sort of led that module. But I also did, and this is probably relevant to some of you, I worked in admissions, so I was one of the people who would read UCAS statements and applications for the university when they came in and sort of make decisions on sort of offers and things. So I'm more than happy to take questions on that because obviously I know it's very relevant to some of you at the end of the session. It was really the sort of teaching the admission stuff was something I was really interested and passionate in, and I sort of found myself not really being too academically minded, so knew it probably wasn't going to be ultimately a career in academia that I was looking for. When I sort of graduated with the PhD, I left to join Deloitte. And I say that's Deloitte's logo now. Same with university. That wasn't their logo when I left. I feel this is just a commentary on how often companies change their logos, but these are the logos now. I joined Deloitte as a management consultant in 2012, and that was kind of my way into thinking about, I probably want to work in industry, but I'm not too sure how or where or why, but I've got this really interesting skill base of economics, of teaching, that I kind of want to put to good use. And it was a really good decision because I really got exposed to a wide variety of industries and kind of businesses really, really quickly in Deloitte and sort of built up my career off that essentially. I was in London at that point, so I was working for Deloitte in London. And then in 2014, the opportunity came up to join Unilever. So I'd been working in consumer packaged goods, which is, things you find on a supermarket shelf. I've been working for those companies at Deloitte. Unilever came in and wanted me to join what's called their advanced analytics kind of area, which is a sort of a little bit I'll talk about data and data science, it's kind of known now. One of the interesting things for me was that it was based up in Port Sunlight at Unilever's historic home up here. So my wife and I relocated up to Chester, which is where I live now. but it was a chance for me to get work a bit closer to where my family are back in the Northwest. So that's the kind of building blocks of my career, I would say. Vicky sort of gave me free rein to put some slides together and think about how I'd want to talk to you. So I would try to put myself in your shoes. What would I want to know at kind of your stage in your life? The kind of question probably you're asking is, so why are careers in large companies relevant to me right now, right? So I found some data because I'm a sort of data scientist and that's what I do. Have a think about what you think these bars kind of maybe represent. So that's 44% at the top there, all the way down to kind of 15% at the bottom. So for those of you who do maths or statistics, that's an interesting distribution. Yeah, there's lots at the tails, but sort of not much in the middle. If I add the axes on, so at the top is 500 or more, all the way down to 0 to 1 at the end. So not sure if you sort of worked it out, but this is actually data on where people will end up working by size of company, right? So at the top there, 44% of people in the UK work in companies that have 500 or more people. So let's call those large companies. 15% of people at the bottom work in companies that have only 0 or 1 employees. It actually is. So either you're a sole trader working on your own, or you and one other person in the company. So my talk is sort of aimed at the top here, so up at the kind of 500 or more level. And so there's this interesting kind of mix of small and intermediate companies in the middle, but 44% is a big number. I would imagine, and I haven't checked because I couldn't find the data, it also gets bigger than 44% if you look at people who go to university. So people who come out of universities with degrees probably end up disproportionately, I would say more than 50% in large companies. So what's the purpose of this talk? The purpose of the talk is to say, look, don't end up here if you actually think you might want to be here, and sort of vice versa, right? So thinking about your career means thinking about the choices you're going to make. And if it's likely that you're going to end up in a large organization and you maybe don't want to or don't think it's right for you, and similarly, you actually do want to end up there and sort of wondering about what routes you've got to get into that 44% at the top, as I say, it's probably relevant for you across a wide range of, educational backgrounds, whatever you study at university, skill sets. I'm aware this isn't a talk about how to become a lawyer or an accountant. This is a talk about what ultimately your day-to-day working life might look like, rather than the skills you've got. So I'm going to do it in 3 parts. So a little bit about a career framework that I think just helps formalize that a bit. A bit on the pros and cons of large companies, and then my sort of tips for success, which are basically just how I've managed to kind of get where I am today. Let me start with a kind of career framework a little bit. So this is maybe kind of what you're thinking about your career at the moment, is that it's ultimately going to be based on what you can do, right? So you're going to, or you are getting, and you're going to get an education. You're going to learn some valuable skills or some valuable knowledge while doing that. The idea is then you get better at those skills, you find things you're really interested in and you refine them, and then sort of you graduate and something magic happens where someone pays you to do that skill, or you set up your own company and you sort of find a marketplace for it and you can sell that skill effectively. And then the end of it is profit, right? You end up getting back what you've invested in your education, and you're able, through your wage and through your income, to kind of earn more than it's cost you to kind of get where you are and get what you know. And that's what, in a simple sense, a career kind of looks like. What I kind of want to talk to you about today is that actually it's a bit broader than that, especially if you are thinking about working in large companies, right? So that maybe works nicely if you're a vet or an architect. It's about honing and refining those skills you have. If you work in large companies, it's a bit broader for a couple of reasons. So you can introduce this idea of how you think. So this is your approach to, problems. This is your approach to business. This is your approach to life. And then you're going to learn different ways and skills about actually variety of things of how to get your job done. So these are going to progress a little bit from left to right. But I wanted to give you a sense, just based on my experience of what that's looked like for me and where I've acquired those kind of skills. So starting on the left, I say I joined university doing maths and economics. That's numeric. That's a very kind of numeric combination of kind of subjects. It was always my strength at school. So I've sort of come through university with just a kind of typical numeric kind of outlook on kind of most things. That's how I approach certainly my work. Economics, for those of you who study it, is all about the study of incentives. So especially when in sort of marketing, which was one of my previous roles, what's the incentive someone's got to buy your product? What's the incentive someone's got to try your product? Or, even to give you feedback on your product. Why should they do the thing that you kind of want them to do? And I sort of studied that and learned all about what that actually means. I have a natural inclination towards financial things, so that's kind of why I joined the private sector. You sort of see things in profit and loss terms a bit easier. But these are all kind of, these aren't skills. These are just kind of ways I kind of think through things. This is how I sort of live my life a little bit, and that's my kind of strengths. So nothing there about, becoming an economist. These are all just different, ways of thinking that I've acquired and sort of feed into kind of almost everything I do now. What can I do? Well, having done economics at sort of quite a high level, you acquire what's called data science skills. So this is working and manipulating data with statistics, computer programs. Hugely fashionable career at the moment. So people with data science skills are really, really in demand in the workplace. One of the things that kind of Deloitte taught me was sort of how to communicate. So even a simpler thing as putting this presentation together is a communication skill, and Deloitte invested an awful lot of time and money in me teaching me how to do that really, really well. And then identifying and solve problems. So my job is kind of a problem-solving job. I have to kind of be able to work with people, work within businesses to get to kind of the root cause of what's problematic or what could be done better, and then practically put in place the tools to solve those problems. So if you wanted to describe my skills are much more in this column, right? I have technical skills in all these things, and they're the things that I refine and get better at every day when I kind of do my job. But it's not just what I do in my job, it's actually how I get my job done. In sort of contrary to a lot of people who work in data, I'm actually a kind of very visual kind of person in my job. If I'm solving a business problem with somebody, I often ask them to draw what they think the solution is, and let's visualize it together, and it helps us communicate better and understand what we do. So I work very visually in my company. I also would say I'm sort of fairly instinctive, so I tend to kind of have a quick idea of what a challenge is and then build a solution out from there. I don't sort of sit and think on it too much. I tend to work quicker than that. And then versatile as well. So I like working across a really wide variety of problems. I don't want to get bogged down in one thing for too long. That's kind of why I've moved around in my career. So that's kind of my career on a page. And so hopefully you can sense it's a bit broader than just, the skills I've acquired. It's all about these components and how I deploy them in sort of what I do. What else would I tell you about these things? So there's a kind of purpose to what I do, which comes from how I think, right? So even if you're not going to go to university, if you want to take time off and go traveling or do some volunteering work, what you're getting at the end of that is kind of more towards what you would call your purpose. So why do you do kind of what you do, and what's at the core of your beliefs and passions about what you work on? What you do is ultimately your skill set. So what can you do is a process of mastery. So you get better at the things you do, you sharpen them and refine those skills, and it can be really rewarding to just simply get better at the things you're good at. And then in terms of how you work, so autonomy means if I just left you to your own devices, what would be your process, right? How would you like to be working to get the things done that you need to do? Do you want to write a list, or do you want to be visual like I am, or work very much off a diary, or more free form? Like how you work is a really interesting component of your career, I think. Interestingly enough, these three concepts, so purpose, mastery, and autonomy, are what a psychologist called Dan Pink talks about in his book Drive. So if you want to understand what motivates people, if you want to understand how people, get up to do their jobs in the morning, it's a really, really great book called Drive, and it touches and says basically these three areas are key to getting the most from employees in any kind of workplace. So sort of my way of thinking about it in these three columns kind of jives nicely with that approach to thinking about work. The other thing I'd say is, you're likely to acquire these thinking skills in your undergrads. Your undergrad doesn't necessarily have to be about what you can do and what you can learn. So I know a lot of you will do sort of English courses or, business studies courses or philosophy courses. They're not necessarily tangible skills that you're getting, but it's all in this left column about how you ultimately think. And that's a really, really valuable component of what education's all about. If you do that, then maybe in postgrad or in professional education, you can be a bit more about your skill set. So, I'm going to join university and do English, but then I'm going to graduate and do some accountancy training and get some more tangible kind of skills in a particular discipline. But then how you work is all about, what jobs have you had? So have you worked in small companies, large companies? Have you worked internationally? Have you worked just in the UK? This kind of, you'll acquire this through your career and keep refining it. But these are the sort of things like if you're thinking about doing part-time work, or you're thinking about doing internships during your studies, or even summer work at the moment, just get a sense for how you like to work and what's your kind of preferred way of working. The reason I put equals apprenticeships ? On here is simply that a lot of really large companies are offering all these things straight out of school now. So I checked, and both Deloitte and Unilever, who I've worked for, now offer routes straight from school into their companies. And to be honest, they're trying to find the best people at an earlier stage, right? So Deloitte and Unilever don't want to wait for you to go through undergrad, postgrad qualifications. They want to try and find you out of school, get you working in their environments, sort of teaching you sort of really tangible skills that are relevant to their business. So if apprenticeships in large companies isn't something you've thought of, there are some really, really great avenues out there at the moment. And I've worked with some apprentices who have come into both Deloitte and Unilever, and they've been some of the most talented people that I've worked with. So it's a really good option to consider as well. So that's a bit of a framework. What about the pros and cons of large companies? Let me talk about some of the pros first. So one of the biggest things in large companies is that you get a really wide variety of experiences. If you have any sort of interest in working globally, internationally, large companies are a great vehicle to do that, because they'll often pay you to go and work in a different country for a period of time. So my wife worked in the Philippines for a year when she was at Deutsche Bank. It's a kind of great avenue to see the world if that's something you'd be really, really interested in. Just simply the breadth of functions within a company. I've worked in marketing, but now I work in research and development. If variety is something you think you want out of a career, then large companies offer it by virtue of the fact that they've got lots and lots of different things that you can work through and work into. Flexibility is becoming something that I think is more and more prominent in what people are looking for in jobs and careers. I put the sort of euro symbol and the baby symbol here for two reasons. So in terms of euros, my compensation for working at Unilever is really only kind of 50% salary, and the other 50% I get is bonuses, benefits, pension schemes. If you're thinking about, it's not just for me all about, the salary I take. I want health insurance. I want, flexibility to take time out of my job to go and do volunteering. Looking at the baby, I had a baby in June last year, and I took 5 months off on shared parental leave, and that was paid at 100% by the company. So I was on full pay while I was off looking after my second child for 5 months. So there are schemes like that all companies have to do, but only large companies usually have the flexibility to pay you full time, and because they've got somebody else who can step in and do your job for a period of time. So I think as people look for more flexibility in their work, I want to work from home more, I only want to work part-time, or I want to do a job share, these things tend to be found more in large companies than they do in small companies. The last thing I'll say is that large companies value different skill sets. So, of my little matrix I put up before, like being numeric, but also being a good communicator, but being very visual is not a kind of normal combination, right? If you're numeric, you tend to be maybe a bit more introvert, and you tend to kind of look more at the numbers rather than the pictures. But if you've got this kind of interesting mix of skills, interesting mix of experiences, and ways you approach problems, then large companies can find homes for that, because they're looking for more viewpoints. They're looking to kind of get people with really rich experiences coming into their companies. They don't just look for one thing. They look for people with things that can add additionally to the skill sets that they already have in the company. So, when I left Warwick with my PhD, it's sort of, there's not usually many routes after a PhD. It's either kind of academia, or if you're in economics consulting. But because I had these kind of other areas I was interested in, Deloitte were very quick to say, look, you come and work for us because you'll do your behavioral economics, but you'll also be able to learn how to work in industry at the same time. So, large companies can accommodate people with really broad skill sets, which is nice. On the cons, so on the screen, you'll see number 506925. That's actually my employee number at university. So I guess if you put a comma in there, I'm the 506,925th person, I don't know, to work for Unilever. But that's a lot of people, right? So there's a lot of people in these large organizations, and it's easy to get kind of identified as a number rather than sort of the person you are. So what do I mean by that? It can be quite hierarchical. So this is a fairly common pyramid structure that most large companies have. You can just sort of, if it's not your bag, if it's not really how you want to work, you want to be kind of more collaborative with everyone in your company, large companies can feel quite hierarchical, just simply because of how they have to operate efficiently. The kind of cogs symbolize that you are a bit of a cog in a machine. You're going to have to work and interact with lots of other people just to get your job done, because your work doesn't just kind of influence the business directly, it also influences the work of all the people around you. So it's really great if you like teamwork, being part of groups of people getting things done. If you'd like to be kind of more, isolated, a bit more individual in your work, then say interacting in this kind of process-driven way might not necessarily be the thing for you. The other thing I'll say is you can be a bit disconnected from both, the strategy at the top end. So I'm not saying the strategy of Unilever, but I'm also not selling soap or tea or kind of shampoo in the marketplace, which is what we sell. So I have to rely on other people in their roles to do some of the other bits of the job. And if I do my job really well, it's not always easy for me to see, the tangible outcome at the sales end, but it's also not, I have to take the strategy that's given to me by the company. So you can be a bit disconnected from what you really feel are the overarching goals and ambitions of the company. And it depends on how comfortable you think you'd be working in that kind of environment. So that's pros and cons. What would I say are some tips for success? So quick game. So here's some deodorants. These are men's deodorants. Apologies to the girls on the call. So those 4 deodorants, so any of them are Unilever products. I don't know if anyone which of those are Unilever products. Some of you might use them already. Reality is they're all Unilever products. So Unilever is the world's largest deodorants company. And the question is, why do we have 4 deodorants, in this case, just in the UK market, right? And the idea is that they're all distinct brands. They all communicate in slightly different ways to their consumers. Sure is kind of a more active deodorant. Lynx is younger men. Vaseline is more sensitive skin caring. And Brut is more fragrance and perfume, so people who prefer that. But we use brands in a way to communicate differentially with our consumers when we sell deodorants. And I'd sort of encourage you to think about, it's not just my picture and my number that I sort of communicate in my large company, but I kind of have a brand as well, right? So when Vicky was saying at the start, I'm an experienced analytics leader, behavioral economist, marketing data scientist, to some extent that's the kind of brand, or that's what I've created as the way I sort of communicate with other people in industry, because it tells them what they need to know about who I am and how I work. So it can be a bit, that language can seem quite convoluted, but it actually simplifies communication in a way for people who work in other large industries. It tells them, what I can do, what I can't do, and it sort of helps them to understand who I am and how I'm likely to work in the company. So I would say know your own brand and know your own kind of USP or unique selling point as you go through your career. So that framework I talked about before, like these are all the things that are relevant to me. You'll find your own things that are relevant to you, but certainly know what those are, know what your strengths are, know what you like, know what you find interesting to do, and then really do those as best you can and kind of maximize that part of you when you go into these large companies. And don't be afraid to kind of say, look, this is who I am and this is the things I do really well for you, because that's kind of your brand and that's what you'll become known for. The other part of what Vicky said on the introduction, before joining Deloitte as a management consultant in marketing operations and customer analytics, again, that's really, really corporate speak. But a little bit what I touched on before, that's all aimed at communication, right? So what is communication? You may, kind of where you are currently in your education, think communication is just about how well you talk in a presentation or how easy it is to stand up and, give a speech or something like that. But communication is this really kind of nuanced, important thing in large companies. And I would say it's the single most important thing that large companies do and do well that makes them as efficient as they are and makes them as kind of big and successful as they are. They just have to be able to communicate very, very efficiently. So all those things in the top left are what the language and terminology that are used within the company that again simplify someone's understanding of what I do for them. And it's just you get these languages all amongst themselves that you have to kind of use and leverage to make the kind of business work as well as it does. So what's important in communication? It's a really kind of difficult skill to get really, really good at, but one of the core principles of it is you are not your audience. So I say we know this in marketing. When we talk to our consumers, we talk about things that are relevant to them, not things that are relevant to us. Similarly, if you're doing talks or presentations, think about what the aim of that communication is. Like, what are you trying to get out from your audience, and tailor the content towards them, right? So very simple example, this presentation's in the merchant school colors because you're my audience today, right? I'm trying to connect with you as individuals and sort of talk to you how you would enjoy being communicated with. One of the hardest things I do in my day-to-day job is send emails, and that seems really strange, but the most kind of effortful thing I have to do is write emails that are kind of brief but detailed, they're kind of impactful but not imposing, and they kind of create what we call transformational action. So they have an impact that means something tangible in the business. And getting all those kind of good things into a short email is incredibly difficult, and it's a skill that, the senior leaders in our company, the people right at the top of the pyramid, have really, really down to a T. It's the thing they do better than everybody else. So, Alan, who's our CEO, is in charge of 160,000 people. How do you get all those 160,000 people to work in the same direction? The trick is very impactful and simple communication. You don't get much chance to interact with everyone, so when you do, it has to be short, sharp, to the point, and it's such an art and such a skill that separates the people who are senior leaders in large organizations aside from everyone else. Last thing I'll say is you often could have given career advice about, try and be a great worker, but really focus on being a great networker in large companies. I would pull back on that a little bit. It's sort of often something that you're taught, but networking only as good as the value it gives you in terms of being better at your job, right? So really try and focus on be famous for your job and the work you do and what you're able to deliver for the company, which is all about being a great worker. And people will get to know you, people will get familiar with you, and people will appreciate you for that work that you do. If you're going to do networking, it's not simply a case of, making sure the senior management know who you are, know your name so you can get promoted. It's networking is much more about, like, who are the other people in the organization, maybe at my level I need to know, who can help me do my job better, right? So if I need some data on our consumers in Brazil, I probably need somebody on the ground in Brazil who I know really well, who can tell me, where that data is, or what it actually tells you about these consumers, or, how much do we pay for this data, and what sort of analytics can I run on it. So networking should always be about broadening your own scope of knowledge and helping you tap into other people's experiences and expertise. It's not quite as simple as, make sure your CV's up to date, make sure your LinkedIn profile's up to date, and go to these kind of networking events, because in large organizations, it's too easy to ignore people like that. People really make an impact when the work they do is really, really impressive, really high quality, and essentially they become famous for their skills as a worker, not necessarily being a great networker. So that was all I sort of, wanted to tell in sort of 20 minutes, just to give you an introduction to, I guess, who I am, what I do in large companies. Very, very happy to take questions on any of that, or sort of anything else you might want to chat about, given, as I say, I did used to read UCAS forms at university, so I'm more than happy to talk about my experiences doing that.
Lucky you.
Yes.
I think there's a couple of questions coming in. I just want to say that was absolutely superb. And while I've got you on, I run employability days at the boys and the girls school in Lower Six, and I think this would be absolutely perfect for that. Sure. So I think I might rope you in next year, if that's okay.
Absolutely no problem.
Okay, so can you see the questions?
Yeah, so I've seen a question for Ben and a question from Adisa as well. So Ben asking, let me read. So I've noticed your career has been centered around the UK and UK companies. Would you discourage starting an American firm as advice from family members who have background in companies such as Kellogg's? The American corporate world is completely different and harsher. Would I apply for an American-led company? It's a really good question. I would say a couple of things on that. So companies like Unilever and sort of large multinational organizations, so Deloitte is another good example of this. they're not really UK companies. They are multinational, sort of faceted companies that work all across the world. And the culture in those companies tends to permeate across geographies. So you have different ways of working in those companies that certainly differ by geography. But to my point earlier around the strategy from those companies, they all come from the same place. And, you know, our CEO is currently Scottish. Our previous CEOs have been Dutch or been English. You tend to get the same types of messages and the same types of ways of working, irrespective of geographies. And that's one of the interesting things about large organizations, is that culture can tend to permeate across geographies in a really interesting way. So should you start in the US? Yeah, if you think that's an experience that you'd want to have. I'd actually think as much about the company I'm working with as the location, right? So, you can have a look at Unilever's website, for example, and see what we stand for, what we work towards, what our strategy is, what our purpose is, what we're aiming to do in the world, and think, is that me? Is that who I am? I will say that when we do interviews now with people, especially people coming into the company, people are much, much, much more interested in their own views on the world and how they align to the company's views on the world, right? So are you somebody who, we talk about it in Unilever as being purpose driven. So, brands that do good, brands that have a purpose in the world and making a real difference on the environment, but also in sort of general sustainable business. Is that something you share? Is that your attitude towards working as well? And I think you'll find different companies have, certainly different approaches to that. And yes, probably some variation across companies, but I'd be confident if I went to work in the US tomorrow and spent 5 years there, I'd be working in a pretty similar way to I would be working in the UK. My wife has worked for Deutsche Bank, and she's worked in the US, she's worked in the Philippines, she's worked in the UK. She would probably, I think, say the same thing as well. Just these companies' cultures tend to permeate really across geographies. Is it harsher in the US? In some instances, but it's more company specific. So I worked in Deloitte, which is a management consultant. Again, Deloitte has offices all around the world. One of the most famous management consultants is McKinsey, which is a US company. But they have a much more kind of ruthless culture. It's kind of what's called an up and out culture. So either you get better and you promote, or you're asked to leave the company, to really sort of encourage, people to do better each year. That would be the same for McKinsey in the UK, and the same for McKinsey in the US, the same for McKinsey in China and in Japan, wherever it happened to be. So I would focus much more on the company than the geography. But no, if you join a large organization, you've got this wonderful flexibility to say, look, I want to work in the States for 6 months a year. I want to go and work in the Philippines. I want to go and work in India. And you'll get this opportunity to sort of experience culturally those countries without, as I say, having to completely, redefine your understanding of how work gets done. I hope that answers your question. So Dieter's question. So how do crises such as coronavirus affect large organizations? Is an excellent question. I'll give you a little bit of behind the scenes. So in Italy, you probably remember at the start of kind of middle of February, there was the first kind of a really bad confirmed case in Europe of community transmission, which is where there was a guy in Italy who got sick, who his cause of coronavirus couldn't be attributed to him coming back from China. That was actually one of Unilever's employees. He was based in a laboratory in a place called Casale, which is a site I manage in my current role. And so Unilever kind of saw firsthand how disruptive this would be to a kind of large organization, because he got sick on the Tuesday. On Thursday there was a whole company meeting of like 1,000 people, and by Friday it was shut down. It was everyone go home, you're all going to get tested, you're all going to have to adapt to a new way of working from home. So literally that weekend people were taking laptops, computer equipment from the office so they could facilitate working from home like this. What you find is that large companies can react to crises really, really well like that. So, we had 1,000 people, of which maybe 500 are chemists, and they need to work in laboratories to get their work done. But in a weekend, they all had the equipment they needed to work from home. We were already thinking about, what's the safe way to reopen the lab so that when we need to do chemistry, we can get back in and do it in a zoned way, in a safe way, maintaining social distancing. And there's just an amazing kind of rallying effect about how people in those companies can pull together very quickly and adapt really quickly to those environments. I spoke to a friend of mine last night who works in a smaller housing company in London, and she was saying they've been so slow to respond, that the leadership hasn't been there. We've found it tough to understand really what they want us to do in this situation. But kind of back to my point around communication, in a crisis, the only really thing that kind of matters is strong and effective communication about how you get people to, respond in the way you want them to pull together to solve the challenge that's at hand. And that's just all effective communication that needs to happen. So large companies tend to be very, very good at responding to these kind of things for that reason. Nishita's questions: what other skills are efficient in large companies apart from communication skills? So yes, I would say communication is the number one, and as you go through your kind of education, you'll understand what more and more that actually means. I think if I looked back at my PhD now and sort of saw how I did writing and saw how I tried to communicate people those concepts, I'd be probably horrified just based on sort of how much better I've got to it. The other kind of skills I would recommend are thinking about how you can kind of be a bit of an entrepreneur. So I sort of talked about autonomy earlier on in the presentation. If you wait for kind of direction to come from large organizations, you might be waiting a while, right? Because the messages can take time to cascade to you, or you're hearing something secondhand or third hand by the time it gets to you. The more you can be a kind of entrepreneur and sort of, really understand what the business wants from you and think proactively about solving its challenges, or new ways to do business, or better and more efficient ways to be organized. The more proactive you are and the more kind of entrepreneurial you are, I think, especially these days, the more they appreciate it and the more they'll find things for you to do. So just having really good ideas, being proactive, being a self-starter. Again, it's not something you're necessarily born with or not. It's a learned skill. You can get better at it through time. Just kind of practicing kind of good tips of entrepreneurship actually serves you really well in large organizations as well. The other tip I would give you is doing the basics right. So there's a kind of expectation, as I say, around things like communication, around things like time management, things like being sort of engaged and being a really good listener when you're in meetings and conversations. And these kind of all seem like really basic things, like why wouldn't you listen in a meeting? But if you've got other things to do, it's hard to do, and you're tired and you just want to get to your next meeting. So I would say trying to do the basics right every time is not taken for granted, right? There are people who just can't continually deliver to a really good standard of performance in everything they do. But if you understand your job and make sure, look, come what may, I'm going to try and answer all my emails promptly, and I'm going to listen in meetings, and I'm going to be really good with my time management and respond to deadlines. Just the kind of basics of good practice of working. Just doing all those things well sets you apart actually a surprisingly long way, and people are incredibly thankful for people who they can rely on and trust. And I didn't really talk about this, but when I talk about, process organizations and being a sort of cog in an organization, that means you have to trust other people a lot in what you do. I have to trust that, your input's going to be there when I need to do my work, and vice versa. And the more people demonstrate to you that they can do everything to a really good standard sort of all the time, the more you trust them. And that's another kind of route to success, I would say. Is the best path into large organizations from more creative mind marketing? So it's one way in. I'd say think about the entire matrix of, what I talked about, how you think, what skills you have, and then how you like to work, because being creative can cut across all of those, right? So I would say, we have some of the most incredibly creative marketeers in terms of the communications that they put out around our products and how they talk to our consumers. And that's such an incredible way of being creative in a large company and having huge and significant impacts. I don't know if you saw the other day, there was someone on Twitter who was essentially saying, thank God that Yorkshire Tea hasn't stood up in solidarity for Black Lives Matters, and then actually Yorkshire Tea went on Twitter and said, please never buy our tea again. We stand in solidarity with these people. And it set off a conversation about, other tea companies essentially saying the same thing, which is, just because we haven't said anything yet on this subject doesn't mean we won't, and doesn't mean we don't find it important. That's really creative in the moment communication and marketing, and really talented people are kind of, paid a lot of money, but also given huge responsibility in being the custodians of those kind of brands. So being creative like that, it's a great organization to do it. I would like to think, say, flipping the coin around a bit, that I'm a creative person. So, I did a PhD, which is essentially creating something that has never been done before. It's brand new research. I think I'm creative in the way I work. As I say, I tend to work very visually, but I actually work in a kind of operational and kind of more of a data role. So creativity interacts with things in lots of different ways, and it's an interesting, there can be really interesting combinations of creativity plus data, or creativity plus computer skills that mean you get into more design and things like that. So yes, creativity marketing is a great outlet for it, but you'll build up more than just that as you go, and that will hopefully find you the right home in a large organization. That's all I can see in the chat. I hope I did answer your questions. If anyone wants to unmute their mic and ask a verbal question, they're more than welcome to do that as well.
Stephen, you've offered some incredible advice. Really, really useful, really good, particularly for our lower six. Really great insight, actually.
That's all right. If we have got lower six, I say no one asked me about it, but I will give, my 2-minute view on UCAS personal statements if anyone's really interested. I used to read them at kind of Warwick, and for those of you who are writing your personal statements, the one thing I always looked for more than anything else was kind of honesty and sort of, really I got a good sense of, I knew this person when I was deciding when to make them an offer or not. So being genuine to who you are, trying to understand yourself, what you like and what you're good at and what you want to work towards, and really coming across as personable, genuine is about the best thing you can do on any university application form. It helps you make a connection with the person who's looking at it, and sort of making them see you in a really, really positive light, which is good. I always worried more about, on personal statements and things, would this person be a really good fit for the university, rather than what's their current, academic status, because whether you've done well or not in exams can be influenced by a really wide variety of things, like your opportunities, the particular things and where you've got to where you are in your career. But just being someone who's kind of, amenable, genuine, nice, personable, that's a trait that will serve you well through all of university. You know you're going to be someone who'll do well in our kind of particular environment. And, I rejected plenty of people in my time who seemed academically incredibly able, but I just didn't feel, they were going to be a good fit in the particular, in that university. Warwick's an interesting example because it's a campus university. And, if you tell me you're kind of a big city person, I don't know you're going to do really well in a campus university. So things like that, knowing sort of who you are, what you like, and communicating that helps us make good offers as much as it helps you finding the right university to go to.
That ties into what you said before about knowing your audience as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I used to not only read UCAS forms, I used to have to mark exams in university as well. And it would often be like, I've got to mark 300 of these things in 2 days or something. Yeah. And the only thing I'm ever looking for in those kind of situations is people who make in an exam, make the answer clear, like use colored pens to highlight the thing you want me to see, because I'm skimming it really quickly. And like knowing I'm a kind of poor examiner who's got to read 300 of these things, the more you can do to kind of simplify what you're doing. It's just about thinking about your audience, and it's so easy to give people marks in exams when they're making it clear and obvious what they're trying to say to you. even if they're not saying it very well, if it's laid out really, really precisely, really nicely, it's such an advantage. So similar kind of concept, like think about your audience when you're communicating with them and think what they're looking for as well.
That's great advice. Do you know what? I really, really enjoyed that, Stephen.
Not a problem at all.
It was obviously I'd looked at the PowerPoint, but it was above and beyond what I expected, and I will absolutely be dragging you into school, kicking and screaming probably. But that would be fantastic advice for year 12 and 13. So I hope you don't mind if I keep in touch.
Absolutely, I'm just across the river in Chester, so not too far at all.
Wonderful. Okay, well I'll let you go. If I tell you what, if Stephen and I hang on for the next couple of minutes, just in case anyone wants to ask anything, and if you don't, you're more than welcome to leave and have a